Alright, before we cluster SQL services, let's go through the Windows cluster in detail to see what it has in Server 2012. Okay, so this is the Windows cluster name, dev SQL CLU, and it has something new in 2012, roles. Whatever the cluster resource groups you will create for Ms Tdc or SQL Server, it will be created under the roles. In the prior editions, I think you will have something like application and services or something like that here. So now everything is a role. So when you create Ms Tdc, you will create a role. Okay, configure a role and add the Ms Tdc service. But when you create the SQL cluster, it will create a role automatically under the roles. Now you have something pool. This is maybe for Hyper-V. I'm not sure, I don't know much about it. So here are the disks. You will see the whatever the clustered resource physical disks you will see here. Okay, so networks here, whatever the networks you set up, and the cluster network 1, which is internal. Cluster use is internal, that means heartbeat connections. Okay, the subnet is 2 and IPv4, and you have a public network which is subnet 1 and IPv4 again. We didn't set up any IPv6. Okay, here you will see the cluster events, whatever the warning or informational error messages or critical messages, whatever the cluster related events or messages will be listed here. If there is any problem with cluster, you have to come and take a look at what the message is. Okay, let's go through the cluster properties. You have the cluster name and what networks here, whatever the networks that you have set up for the cluster. You have one public and another one is private. Both are IPv4 networks and no IPv6. We didn't set up any. And the current host server, the active node is node 1 out of 3 nodes that we have set up cluster. Okay, the configuration is node majority. When we set up the cluster automatically determine this is the typical or best quorum configuration, and it use the node majority. We can set up the cluster configuration, the quorum settings. We can create a vote for disk or the file share, in order to attain the odd number of votes for healthy quorum. Okay, so cluster events, again when you click that you will go here. Let's take a look at the quorum configuration, because quorum configuration is important. Healthy quorum configuration will keep the cluster up and running. If the quorum goes down, then your cluster may go down. Okay, so in order to change the quorum configuration, you have to go here and select the quorum configuration here. Okay, so before I change the configuration, let me explain what quorum configuration and how to set up. Basically, quorum needs to have odd number of votes okay, it needs to have odd number of votes. So it uses nodes. In our case we have 3 nodes. Okay, so just in our case just node majority is fine. For example, if you are clustering a 2 node cluster, okay, node 1 and node 2, so every node will have 1 vote. We can assign one vote to every node. Okay, so you have 2 nodes, so 2 votes. So if one goes down, then you will have just 1 vote, which is 50% of majority. So it needs to have greater than 50% majority to determine or decide how to fail over. or to which server to fail over. Okay, so if you have two node cluster, then and you assign one vote for every node, and if one server goes down, then the remaining node will have just one vote and it will have just 50% majority. Okay, it will not have greater than 50% majority. So the quorum cannot decide. Quorum needs to have a greater than 50% majority. Okay, so it cannot decide to fail over to node 2. So it fails. In that case, your cluster will go down. Okay, so that is why you need to have healthy quorum. So for that reason, you need to have one more vote. So how are you going to decide to give one more vote? For example, if you have just two servers, you are clustering two servers, then you need to assign one more thing, one more vote to something else. What is it? Something else. You have 5 shareable disk here. Okay, shareable resource. So you can assign a disk one vote. So now you have 3 votes. Okay, so which is odd number of votes. Now if this server goes down, then you will have 2 votes. Okay, 2 votes form two-third majority, so which is greater than 50%. Now quorum will stay active, healthy, and determines, okay, node 1 went down, now let's fail over the services to node 2. Okay, then you will have the cluster up and running on node 2. Okay, which is made possible by assigning one vote to the disk. Okay, so like that you can assign a vote to file share instead of disk in order to attain 3 votes. Okay, so when you cluster 3 nodes, in our case, the cluster setup, it identified, okay, I got healthy quorum, recommended quorum configuration by assigning one vote to every node. Let's give one vote to every node. Okay, but if you are clustering 2 node server, then you need to have additional vote, something like that. For example, let us say you are clustering 2 nodes. Okay, node 1 and let us say you have 3 nodes here. Okay, node 1, node 2 are in primary data center, node 3 is in different data center. Okay, so you don't want to assign vote to a server which is in the remote data center. Okay, basically it's a some shops might decide, okay, they don't want to assign a vote because the server is unstable. Okay, we don't want a remote secondary data center to have one vote and fail over the services to the secondary data center. Okay, to host a server. Okay, so in that case, I might decide to remove this node, even though I have see, for example, right now we have something like this. Okay, so node 3 is a secondary data center and we wanted to remove this node. So okay, so let us say we remove this node and we have to assign one more vote. So in that case, we cannot fail over the services to node 3. Okay, we have to do a force failover there. So let us change the quorum settings. Before I explain the quorum settings, let me explain this a little bit. You can move the cluster resources. Okay, you can move the cluster to any node. This is something new. Okay, in 2012, you have a best possible node or a select node. For example, I have a node 1. This is the active node in this cluster. This is the server that is hosting the cluster. This is the server that is processing the request, that will process the request if anybody uses this cluster. Okay, so node 2 and node 3 are passive right now. So I wanted to fail over the services to different node. Okay, I can say best possible node, which it determines cluster network name is okay. Now the cluster is back online and node 3 is active. Okay, it determined node 3 is best possible server. Okay, but you want to have more control over which node to fail over. So you go here and you say my Windows cluster should fail over the services to node 2. You select that node and click OK. Now it fail over the Windows cluster to the node 2. Okay, so now let's talk about quorum settings. Now in order to change the quorum setting, you come to this screen and you select the advanced configuration and witness, and you come here, and now you don't want to assign a vote to node 3, you can remove it. This is possible in 2012. You can remove node 3 here, and you can select whichever nodes that you wanted to assign votes, and allow cluster to dynamically manage assignment of node votes. So you can keep that, and you can use the shareable disk as a witness, or you can use file share as witness. Okay, so it says this is recommended because nodes that are configured to be members to the cluster 3, nodes that are assigned votes to participate in quorum calculation is 2, and it is recommended to add one more witness in the quorum. So that is why it is saying this is recommended, and this is not recommended. Okay, so you can say node majority. Okay, so node majority. So how many nodes? You have 2 nodes. This node is non-voting member. Okay, so now if I click next, okay, so let us fail over the okay, so now you have node 1 active. Okay, so but you don't know the node majority, but you don't know how many nodes. You have to take a look at the cluster quorum configuration, but it should write a message here. Let's see if it writes a message here. Okay, um, now you have 2 nodes participating in the quorum configuration, node 1 and node 2. Okay, so can we do a failover to node 3 because we removed that node? You can see what nodes we have. Okay, so you can see here these 2 are the nodes. So you can see here node majority. Okay, node 1 is presently active server. Okay, and you have another node 2. Now let's add a disk. You have 2 nodes participating in the quorum configuration, and you did not select the node 2. You need to have 3 votes, odd number of votes. You can say I wanted to use a disk shareable resource and assign a vote. Okay, now you have node and disk majority. Okay, so the voting members, these are the voting nodes and the cluster disk one. So you have node 1, node 2, 2 votes here, and 3 total 3 votes. Okay, so now it is a healthy configuration. Okay, so you can say old value, new value, okay, whatever the configuration that we made. Okay, or you can use file share, for example, configure a file share. Let us keep the file share on domain controller. Now you have node and file share majority. It says these two nodes have votes, and now you use cluster DC quorum share and assign one vote for that. Okay, now you have total 3 votes. So you can set up something like this. Either way, finally what you need to understand, you need to have odd number of votes to keep the cluster quorum configuration. Okay, to to have the cluster up and running. Otherwise it cannot decide how, to which server to fail over, and that is something that you need to do, decide when you set up cluster. Okay, migrate roles, I guess this might be something to do for migrating from earlier versions of Windows operating system. This is something new in 2012 cluster. You can configure a role, or you can configure from here. Okay, you can validate cluster, you can validate the cluster again if you made any changes to network or shareable disk, and you can add a node. For example, you wanted to add one more node. You create another server and add that server to existing cluster. So you come here and add that node. Okay, to remove that node, you go here and say evict that node. Okay, so if you evict that node, basically you are removing that node from this cluster. Let us do that. Okay, that node is gone. Okay, so you can again add that node. Okay, the node 3 has been added successfully. It says there are some warnings. Cluster has odd number of nodes and disk witness. Consider removing the disk witness. Okay, alright, so now we have 3 nodes. We can revert it back to just use the node majority instead of if you select typical settings, which is recommended, because cluster knows there are 3 nodes, it doesn't need to use disk or file share. Okay, so that's why it is typically recommended. Okay, otherwise you can add or change the witness here, or you can go this advanced configuration and remove the nodes. If you select this option, you cannot remove nodes. You can add or remove the witness, disk or file share. In order to change the nodes in the configuration, you have to select this option. Okay, here you have the option to select what nodes. You can say I don't want any node. Okay, you can select something like that. So in this case, I'm going to select all nodes, because let us go here, use typical, which is all nodes to participate in this. So it will remove that, just the node majority. It will remove that file share. It will not remove the file share, but it will not use the file share for the quorum settings. Okay, just the node majority. Okay, so that is what it is. Let us see if we have anything to explain here. More actions. You can shut down the cluster. You can destroy the cluster. You can fail over the cluster services to another node here, and the cluster aware updating. This is something new in Windows Server 2012. So what is this cluster aware updating? You can update the Windows patches or software updates for the 3 nodes. let us say this is presently active server. I don't know which one is active. Let us okay, node 1 is active. Okay, so now you can say apply the updates. Okay, you can apply the Windows patches to all the nodes in the cluster. So what happens when you say apply the updates to this cluster, it will update all the passive nodes first. It will apply the passive nodes and it will restart the server or cluster if it is required. And finally, before it applies the patches on the active node, it fails over the services to the one of the nodes, and it applies the patches on the active node. Okay, and it doesn't fail back to node 1. Whatever the server it failed over, it will be the services will be running there. Okay, so for example, let us say node 1 is active. First, in this case, what it does, it applies the Windows patches here, reboot the server, apply the Windows patches here, reboot the server, and fail over the services from node 1 to node 2. Now node 2 will be active and node 1 will be passive. Then it applies the Windows patches on node 1 and restart the server. That's it. It doesn't do anything else. So instead of you go and do manually applying the Windows patches on the servers, on the cluster nodes, you can set up a policy here. Okay, you can set up the update procedures. So update procedure here. So it will automatically take care of updating the nodes. Okay, so that is what cluster aware updating. So basically it updates all the nodes and do a failover, update the former active node and does all the work that you manually do. Okay, that is something new in Windows Server 2012. Okay, so let's see if we have anything. So this is the Windows cluster name and the resource types, possible resource types, cluster permissions. So there is nothing much here. So you can create empty role or you can configure a role with a service. Okay, and you have nodes and you can pass the node. Okay, drain the nodes here, drain the roles here, resume if you have passed node. Okay, so you can view the critical events for that particular node and you can stop cluster service on a particular node. Okay, storage, there is nothing much in storage. You can add a disk. Okay, let us say you have 5 disks here and you need one more shareable storage and you create a LUN and you wanted to assign that LUN and add the disk to this cluster. So here is how you can do it. Okay, you can move the storage to another node. Okay, so that is possible. So here are the properties of the shareable disk. You can take a particular disk offline to do some maintenance. Okay, and this is something related to Hyper-V, which I don't have enough knowledge on that. Whatever the critical events related to that disk and more action, you can use turn on maintenance mode and do some maintenance on that disk. Okay, and you can do a simulate failover. Okay, so this is something to do with Hyper-V pools, and that's pretty much it. That is the details of Windows cluster. Okay, so now let's start clustering SQL Server. To install SQL cluster, we need to provide the ISO file to install SQL services. So for that, so I have the SQL Server trial edition, SQL Server 2012 Enterprise Trial Edition ISO file on my laptop. Okay, so let us go here. Now you can download SQL 2012 RTM, or you can use the slipstream version. That means this is RTM plus service pack 1 both combined. Okay, when you use the updated, when you use the latest download, it will come with RTM plus SP1 together, which is called full slipstream version. So you can use that, but since I am going to explain the service, how to install the service pack 1 later, so I am going to use RTM version. Okay, but for your production or for your environment, you may want to select the latest latest version, which includes service pack 1, so you don't need to apply service pack 1 again. So I am selecting RTM SQL 2012 enterprise trial. So when I select that, now it will appear here. Okay, let us take no action. Okay, so this is what it is. So I got the DVD drive. It's available for now to install. Okay, before I install SQL cluster, we need to install Ms Tdc. If you are using distributed transaction, you need to configure Ms Tdc service. If you are not using distributed transaction, you don't need to have Ms Tdc service. Okay, not only creating Ms Tdc service, you need to enable the application role for incoming and outgoing transaction. You have to enable that we already did it previously. Now we are going to create the Ms Tdc service. Okay, so select the distributed transaction coordinator. You can say Ms DTC, something like this, and we assigned a IP address for Ms DTC. Let us see what IP address we have given. Okay, 115. You have to select a disk where you store the MSDTC. I guess G drive we created for MSDTC. Let us see. Yeah, G drive for MSDTC. Select that, which is cluster disk 2, and it says you are using cluster disk 2 and 115. Yeah, everything is fine. Okay, so we created the MSDTC resource group, the cluster group. All right, so now it is running the cluster resource for MSDTC. Let's take a look at the properties of MSDTC. This is the network name, the client access point. Okay, so this is how you can access this resource group, this IP address, and this is the service, MSDTC service on all 3 nodes, whichever nodes. Okay, you can, in the advanced policies, you can remove whichever nodes that you don't want to participate in this cluster, in this MSDTC cluster. Okay, so this is the storage it is using. Okay, so if you go to the disk, now the disk 2 is assigned to MSDTC. Okay, prefer nodes any. Okay, it doesn't have any preferred node, but you can select a preferred node. So if you select a preferred node, then it will fail back to this preferred node if it is available, so which is not a recommended thing. But it's up to you. If you have a stable or high caliber server which you always wanted to host Ms Tdc, then you can select that node as a preferred owner. We have created Ms Tdc. Now it's time to install SQL Server. Now we are installing SQL Server RTM version. Select the installation. You have to select new failover cluster installation. You can also install standalone version of SQL Server on this node. Basically, you are not prevented from doing this, but since you are installing SQL Server cluster, so you have to select this option. You can select the evaluation edition. If you have license key, you can enter it here. Since I am using trial edition, I can keep the evaluation there. Select the license terms. If you want to send data to Microsoft, you can do that. Now this is something new. It retrieves the product updates as part of installation, but you can just leave it. You can uncheck it and click next, but since I have internet connectivity to the server, I'm going to select this option and click next. It may not retrieve entire 26 MB right now. Sometimes it retrieves just partial software updates, and later it uses internet connectivity to download the remaining software. Okay, it depends. Sometimes it just retrieves 26 MB and sometimes it doesn't.